I'd like to welcome you here to our session. Bill and I have been here to HI-TEC a few times talking about the need to teach Internet of Things. So this time we're here to say, now that we've done it for a little bit, here's a real handy tool that you can apply. So again, my name is Brian Nelson. I'm a professor at Lansing Community College in Lansing, Michigan. And
Bill Saichek from Orange Coast College in Southern California, the other Orange County for those of you from Florida. The real Orange County for those of you from Florida.
So should I say the real Lansing for those of you?
That's true. Yeah, why don't we do that?
All right. So anyways, we're here to talk about teaching the Internet of Things, the concepts behind it with the Raspberry Pi. But first, a word from our sponsor. So Bill and I are only here because we're part of the National Convergence Technology Center grant. We have been through the years with them since
2004, 5, 6, something like that.
2007 for Lansing, and we've received a ton of excellent training. Bill has given excellent training.
So has Brian.
Part of it. It's a very worthwhile endeavor. If you're a faculty member in the IT area, you get a chance to network with your fellow faculty across the country. It looks like it's the Convergence College network has expanded to over 70 colleges now in 28 different states, and they sponsor training events every summer. I think the latest one, there was 105 IT faculty members receiving training in various aspects. So it's very worthwhile. So if you have any interest in that, there's some people from the CTC here. Of course, you all know that our main PI is Ann the healer. You certainly have seen her a lot during this conference. So it's a very worthwhile thing. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And hopefully, if you're interested, you'll approach them about that. All right, so again, we've talked before about why the Internet of Things is important to teach, and now it's even more. The whole concept of IoT, the industry itself, is just growing at an extremely fast rate. It's one of those things like our speaker at the first luncheon was talking about. It's a disruptive technology that's growing and growing.
If you were here a number of years ago when Brian and I first started presenting on IoT, 4 years ago? We did our first IoT. Everybody kind of looked at us and went, huh? What's that? And you look at this conference here, and I don't think I've been to a single session that hasn't, if not explicitly spoken to IoT, at least spoke about it in the fringes, as in moving, we're moving data acquisition, which we heard about today, more away from the more traditional data entry methodologies, and it's all going to be coming in through sensors, and it's all going to be running actuators. So the sheer volume of data that are going to be collected by these IoT devices, not just the residential devices that we are going to be demonstrating here today, but industrial and commercial are the big futures. And we were glad that we were on the cutting edge of it, so hopefully we will encourage many of you to take some of these back to your classes and schools in some way, shape, and form.
So again, there's hundreds, even talking just from the residential market point of view, there's hundreds of new devices being released all the time. Every time I get these emails from Amazon, it's got all these new devices with these new brand names that I've never ever heard of. Okay, so it's growing. They're starting to work leveraging standard protocols, so those are important to be taught. Security, on the other hand, is just sort of starting to be addressed. I think I saw in an article a month or so ago that some of the industry leaders are getting together and talking about developing a set of minimum guidelines that IoT devices have to meet in order to be marketed. So that's coming, but it's been slow in coming. And then there's the whole privacy issue thing. I mentioned the emails from Amazon that I get, and if you go through and you really look at those devices, especially the low-end, low-cost devices, they all tend to use the same app, and that's going to some cloud-based server, who knows where. Many of the low-end cameras don't function as independent devices. They have to be attached to some cloud somewhere in the world, so all that data is being funneled through there and comes back to the user. So there's some privacy things here that people need to be aware of as well. So again, there's a number of concepts. There's a big list here, sort of an eye chart, but a number of things that need to be taught when you're talking about the Internet of Things. There's all of the typical networking type things, the traditional Ethernet and Wi-Fi, the popular protocols like TCP and UDP, especially UDP. That's used a lot in IoT. Power over Ethernet, power line networking, so alternative methods of delivering network connections. There's some unique protocols, wireless protocols. In the residential market, for instance, there's Zigbee and Z-Wave, which are different than Wi-Fi, and they're specialized just for home control type devices.
But they are still standardized protocols, so it's not like proprietary to any, although Z-Wave is somewhat proprietary in the fact that it's you have to register if you want to build a Z-Wave device, but I think the buy-in cost is pennies for manufacturers, so that's why so many of them adapted to it. But again, we're talking standardized protocols, not something like where you have an Allen Bradley with a particular protocol, or a Siemens, or a Honeywell, or a Johnson control system. We're talking trying to standardize on existing protocol platforms.
And there's some protocols that have sort of been resurrected in order to be applied to IoT. MQTT is a protocol that's a real low-level, lightweight protocol that a lot of these devices use. So students need to be aware of those things. Security, obviously. Again, that's sort of been lacking in the IoT field, but something that students need to be aware of. Certainly wireless security, the whole topic of VPNs, virtual LANs, secure web access, and then the whole password and authentication practices. I think I was reading in the article about the manufacturer consortium. They wanted to make it mandatory that IoT devices make you change the default passwords, because that has led to problems in the past. And then the whole concept of, once you've got these devices, how do you use them? What are sensors? What are outputs and actuators? What are automations that you can do? As an electrical engineer, it took me a while to get my hands around the fact that sensors aren't these devices with wires on them. I mean, that they are. But sensors are anything that gives you information. It could be a website. It could be anything that provides you information. So, for instance, on my home system, I have some web address that the system goes out to and tells it for every day when sundown and sunset is. That way my lights turn on and off according to when sundown and sunset is, and not some time of day, because that varies all throughout the year. So that's a sensor to my system. So, the concepts can be taught using commercially available things that you can buy through your favorite supplier. If you're talking about commercial and residential IoT, you're talking about HVAC systems, lighting controls, media distribution, surveillance, access controls.
Fancy way of saying door locks.
Well, if you
and other things,
if you're talking about, for instance, school systems, access controls are a huge deal. Who can come in, who can't. So it's scalable. Environmental monitoring. And so you can buy separate equipment to illustrate those concepts, but wouldn't it be nice if there was a single platform that you could use to cover most of the concepts you need to teach and can interface with most of the equipment. And probably no surprise given the title of PowerPoint, we think the Raspberry Pi is very suitable for that. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what a Raspberry Pi is? Okay, so
okay, how many of you have Raspberry Pis? That's a better answer. I like that one better.
That's absolutely great.
How many have more than one?
Yeah. How many have already gotten the 4? I can't get one! They're out of stock.
Yeah. So obviously they're inexpensive, and what's great about them is every time they introduce a new one, they sort of keep the price point right where the old one was. So that's great. They're readily available unless they're the latest one. They just came out a few weeks ago. Certainly there's a large user base. We saw it. Everybody raise their hands. I mean, this is not uncommon. And because of that, there's a ton of basically free software out there. You know, there's open source software everywhere for it. It's reasonably powerful. This latest one that just came out is probably more than reasonably powerful.
You know, you look at quad core. They have the little higher tier with 4 gigabytes of memory. It has gigabit Ethernet as well as still has Bluetooth and everything like that.
Multiple HDMI.
Multiple display. I mean, it looks. I'm sitting there going, that's more powerful than my first computer in 1990.
How can I justify to the wife I need it?
I just buy it and sneak it in.
Yeah. And because it's Linux based, what I really like about it as a teaching tool is I can use it for other classes besides IoT. It's not something that I'm just going to haul out for that class and then stuff back in the storeroom until I teach it again. It's something I can use for other classes. So you can maximize your investment. So I guess I'm not going to bore the crowd with this one since it looks like most of you have a Raspberry Pi. So I think we can skip right through this. You all are well aware of the features. So we want to talk a little bit about the Raspberry Pi as a platform to do labs with. So the advantages are, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the use of open source software eliminates licensing issues, and the price is right. It's easy to leverage existing lab equipment that most IT programs have. You usually have hand-me-down laptops, at least, and some inexpensive, Cisco or Linksys networking type equipment. So there's no real investment there. And the cost of the Raspberry Pis themselves, and as I'll show later, some of the things you can hook up to it are low enough so that you can easily afford enough sets that you don't have to have groups of 3 or 4 using them. You can have groups of 2. You can buy multiple sets of hardware. So that helps out as well. So in the next slides, we're going to just show some labs that can be done using the Raspberry Pi. And so we'll go through these.
And all of these labs are written. Either Brian has written the majority of the ones for sensors, actuators, and IoT. I've written a few of those myself. I've done a lot of the I've stolen a lot of the labs from surveillance, VPN, radius servers. So again, copy and steal everything, but make sure you attribute it. Yeah.
So for instance, a simple sensor actuator lab. So this is sort of the one that I have my students do first. Because the stuff's real easy. You just wire it up to the GPIO port, and then it just works. You don't have to put your email address or anything. I mean, the stuff just works.
I'm going to do this carefully, but this is what it is. This is the temperature, humidity sensor, and put that down so I don't break it.
And we utilize a piece of software called Home Assistant. It's an open source home control piece of software which has a huge following. It's got a very active user base, and any help you need, you can probably look at their forums and find out exactly what you need to know.
How many of you are familiar with either the Samsung Home, Google Home, Vera, HomeSeer, those kind of microcontrol, smart things, all that? That's what Home Assistant is. It allows you to do exactly what you can do on any of those hundreds to maybe even 1,000 by the time you're up to all the controls systems on a Raspberry Pi with very, very, very inexpensive sensors and actuators.
So basically, students just add, there's a configuration file that they have to go in, and if they want to add a component, they just have to add the configuration verbiage to that. And then, what I have to do is once the devices are functional, then they can write simple automations around the devices using, if this, then that sort of thing. So for instance, if you're using a temperature sensor, the temperature is greater than a value, turn on the LED. If the temperature is less than a value, then turn off the LED. And I use this lab as a springboard to the more complicated labs, because this one's just so easy. And then there's, you can use labs with ZigBee, Z-Wave, and Wi-Fi devices. We have to caution you though. When these devices are in pairing mode, they will pair with whichever controller happens to be out there looking for something. So if you have multiple students pairing at the same time, they wind up pairing each other's devices, and when they try to control what they think is their light, they're actually turning on someone else's light. So
There's actually kind of fun to watch, but it kind of...
Bill and I found this out the hard way 2 summers ago.
Right.
We were doing
and we're sitting there going, how is it working? Hey, how come somebody's turning on my light? Oops.
Oops.
So it's a real interesting game. Now, it's actually a lot of fun to do that if you then leverage the idea of broadcast-based networks as opposed to address-based network. Well, it's all address-based, but basically discovery being just simply who broadcasts and who connects first. So you do have to play a little bit of a game with your students, okay? If you're ready to pair, announce it, and everybody else, don't pair. So we had that little issue a couple of times. But once we figured it out, it works great.
I try to get around that by having like one group do a Wi-Fi device, one group do a ZigBee device, another group do a Z-Wave device, and then have the same thing. And that way, you only got 2 pairs doing ZigBee, 2 pairs doing Z-Wave. Something that they didn't put on slide we should mention though is that the Raspberry Pi by itself cannot access ZigBee or Z-Wave devices. You have to buy a USB dongle that goes on it for about 40 bucks. That one there will do both ZigBee and Z-Wave, so it's the one I like.
And it was unavailable for a long time, but it's finally back on the market on Amazon. So if you're at the least bit interested, you might want to drop 40 bucks or so and get one or maybe 2 while, because they tend to do it in batches. Like all of a sudden they'll be there and you get them.
So it's the same thing. They have to add the configurations for the devices to their config files. They have to configure the Z-Wave or the ZigBee. And it's real good for them to go through the whole pairing aspect and getting it to work. Then again, they can write automations around it. Another fun lab that they like to do is one of the big things in any automation, especially residential automation, is presence detection. Because you want your system to maybe do something different when one person's home versus when another person's home. So for instance, in the wintertime when my wife's home, the thermostat is here. When she's not home, it's down here. Okay. So the system doesn't really know if she's home or I'm home, but it does know when our phone is home. Okay. So it uses standard network tools in order to detect when your phone is there or not. So the students, I have them do a lab when they just basically connect or disconnect from their Wi-Fi, and when that happens, the light will go on and off. So you can tell who's hooked up to their router by how many lights are on. So you can do simple things like that. Now in the session we did this summer, somebody did a setup where he had one of these multicolored bulbs, and he would have it light to a different color depending upon who's home, or if it had motion detection here or there, it would have different colors. So you could tell real easily by looking at the light what was exactly going on. So that was kind of cool.
So some of the other things, another very interesting, and this is actually kind of a bridge lab that doesn't necessarily IoT specific, but also can be used with any kind of, like say, networking, even fundamentals class, like an A+ class, but it fits into Net+, fits also into a security class, video surveillance. Big, very, very important, becoming very important in residential. Commercial and industrial environments, they are just incredible users of video. Well, Home Assistant on the Raspberry Pi with a very inexpensive camera system, you can and open source software, you can demonstrate some pretty good video surveillance. So there are a number of cameras it can support. We have a simple little Raspberry Pi camera.
It packs well in a suitcase.
Yeah, it's not, I would not say it's something I would use for surveillance. It's more like closer akin to a webcam. But like this summer, we used FOSS cams that actually have full motion control, pan, tilt, zoom, and we took advantage of those as well. And we actually leveraged another piece of open source software that integrates with Home Assistant called iSpy. If you're looking for a nice little video surveillance software package, open source, free, very powerful, doesn't have all the features you would see in, say, something like Milestone's X-Protect or Blue Iris or any of those, but the price is right. And it does a lot of things, and you can have multiple cameras, multiple views. You can control the pan, tilt, and zoom from Home Assistant, which means you can control it from a mobile device, etc. So it's an excellent way. They have to learn how to configure again. Now, these configurations that we're talking about in this YAML, config.yaml file, is Python. It was written in Python. All of it is written. Now, you're not writing full programs. You're writing basically blocks of code. But for those of you that are involved with teaching programming or have relationships with your computer science where programming is being taught, there's a nice bridge integration as well.
Just the iSpy program you mentioned runs on a PC.
Right. You run that on a PC, not on the Pi. But it does integrate across. But you don't need a very powerful computer. I'm running it on an 8-year-old laptop that the students use to connect. Now here's another one that, again, this is not something that would traditionally be thought of from Internet of Things. Although, as part of the security aspect of it, is like you say, okay, how are we going to secure IoT? Well, one of the major securities is VPN. And all of you are probably aware of open source and very highly touted VPN software called OpenVPN. How many of you are familiar with OpenVPN? Okay. OpenVPN is an excellent program. You can download the appliance for free. Unfortunately, you only get, if you use their appliance, you can only have 2 cameras for a free license, and you got to pay extra. But you can download a generic version. Well, that's what they did here. On the Raspberry Pi, they have on Raspbian, which is the Debian distro. You simply download the OpenVPN server component. It has a wizard. It's not a GUI, but it has a wizard that will walk you through the configuration and setup. And then all you have to do is then set up a little bit of port forwarding on your router, which is a great thing to teach. Now, it takes a lot of the time, actually it takes my students longer to do the certificate, the RSA certificate, than to actually get the OpenVPN running. But what an opportunity. Now you're teaching them not just VPN, but you're teaching them certificate services. And again, it's all done on a Pi. So I think it's an excellent project, and it's something that we have written and we can make available. This one's a little bit, this is the follow-on to the VPN lab that I used, and it's actually using free radius on a Raspberry Pi, and again, it's powerful enough to run it. It runs it very nicely. For those of you that have ever taught classes in wireless and you try to explain radius servers, but you don't happen to have a Cisco AP that you can use, or you don't have an expensive controller device or anything like that, again, very free. Now, this is not a program I would suggest as a first project, primarily because the Radius server, piece of cake, but Radius requires a lot of other back-end services, primarily, and the one that really takes probably the most time to configure is the MySQL database for authentication. There are ways of doing the free Radius server okay with not having encrypted and highly secure authentication. If you're less concerned about authentication, the Radius server is very easy. So we have found out that the Raspberry Pi, this lowly little $35 computer, which can get up to be about $70 by the time you add a bunch of stuff to it, is a wonderful platform. How many of you are actually using Raspberry Pis in a class environment? Yeah, it is. It's great. I even tell my students, I said, look, we have a bunch of Pis that you can use, but you'd be much better off going over to pick your favorite store, buy a Pi, buy a case, bring it in, we'll set it up, you take it home and can do something useful with it. So we do that as well. You can demonstrate a ton of concepts, not just IoT. IoT has become like wonderful. I mean, I cannot think of a better platform for teaching IoT concepts than a Raspberry Pi. You can compare it with an Arduino if you're looking for a little bit more control systems or better, more diversified sensors and actuators. But just the Pi itself is a wonderful platform to begin with.
So the reason it's so applicable is the fact that there's so much user support out there. There's so much open source software that if you want to do something, chances are you can Google it with Raspberry Pi and figure out how it's done. So the possibilities that you can cover in a lab are almost endless. Now I want to talk a little bit about the fact that school where I'm at, the IoT class is a first-year class. It has no prerequisites at all. So anybody can walk off the street and take it. As a matter of fact, our electrical program found out about it, and now it's a required class for their students, just because electricians are having to deal with IoT. Having to deal with all of the low voltage wiring and whatever it deals with IoT. I just looked at my current class list, and probably half my students are traditional IT students. Another large fraction of them are electrical students. And I noticed I've even got an HVAC student, and I've got an automotive student, and I've got 2 people which are non-declare majors. So it becomes an avenue for us to get people, because it's fun. This stuff's fun. It's a very hands-on class. I've got 45 labs students have to work through throughout the course of the semester. And it's almost a marketing tool to get people interested in IT, because it's a lot more fun than Cisco.
No criticism of Cisco's.
But I just took some Cisco classes, and I just told myself I could never make a living doing this because I would just get bored. But this stuff's fun. On the other hand, Bill uses it as a second year class.
Actually, I stole his idea. Actually, have moved it down. I've taken out some of the more complex networking labs, such as the VPN. Well, I leave the VPN in, but like the free Radius lab and all of that. Add a few other more labs, and I've been promoting the classes almost exclusively outside of traditional computer science and IT. I've recruited interior design because I told them that if you are going to be designing residences or buildings, and you're going to be putting in, and people are going to want to put in these things, and these things are largely wireless controlled, and a lot of them are wired controlled, and you didn't design the facility, the building, the room, whatever, to accommodate with not just the way you put the walls in, the materials you use. So interior design, architecture, construction. I've even gotten some interest from some of the areas like automotive and aircraft maintenance, where they're saying, well, wait a minute, these kinds of sensors and actuators are what we're starting to see in automobiles and planes. So, the more standard as opposed to the very proprietary protocols. Our students need to know these things. Our HVAC instructor said, hey, every environmental control, from a home thermostat to a smart building, is all going to be this IoT stuff. I have no desire to learn a thing about it, but my students sure as hell do. So he is basically saying, look, you guys need to learn this. Go over to Bill's class, take this class. So I've kind of stolen Brian's idea and have moved it down. What I'm doing now is developing a second semester class where I'm going to now be bringing in more of the advanced networking, but actually starting to think about bringing in industrial and commercial control systems as well.
All right, so we talked about the home system program. So it's all accessed via web-based GUI. You just put in the IP address and it brings it up.
You want to explain you want me to explain what we have, or do you want to explain?
Yeah, well, I can go. So,
or demo it as we go through.
Yeah. So for instance, I have one switch, which is a Wi-Fi switch. Light comes on here. Turn that on and off.
Wi-Fi plug turns on and off.
And I spare no expense with the lights. We have a Z-Wave based light, which will be coming on. Now, if it's an actual light, of course, you can go in and mess. Whoops, I picked the wrong one here. You can go in and mess with the dimming if you want, and those dimming amounts can also be part of an automation. So certain times of day you can have it come on at certain dim levels or not. Also have a Zigbee light, which I'll turn on here, and that one gets really bright. So I already had that turned down a little bit. But if you don't want to mess with any of these consumer type things, you can just have it set up so it just turns on a simple LED, like the red LED down the table there. So again, that's part of that first lab, where I have students just turn LEDs on and off.
Well, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. And have an excellent trip home.